we now have Professor Adam Dunn from the University of Sydney, who it must be about after 2 in the morning where you are, Adam, so I really appreciate you making this presentation. He's the head of biomedical informatics and digital health at the University of Sydney, and he's going to talk about a new area of work, also infodemiology and progress on the public health research agenda for managing infodemics. So over to you, Adam.
Thank you very much for inviting me. And yes, it is 2 a.m. here. So when presenting in Australia, we like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands we talk and learn from. And today I'm speaking from the land of the Wallumattagal, and I'd like to offer my respects to elders past and present. In the next sort of less than 10 minutes, I'm going to go through the work that's been done in infodemiology and provide a brief update on the current state of play in the field. Next slide, please. So let's start with what we mean by an infodemic, where you might hear a lot about the volume of misinformation that can be found online, and it's been mentioned a couple of times today already. The concept of an infodemic is broader, and it's defined by the excess of information, including false or misleading information that spreads online and offline during a health emergency. We know that infodemics must be having some sort of an impact because of risky behaviours that we've observed during the pandemic, including the misuse and poisonings associated with unproven treatment. The other impact we think happens with infodemics is reduced trust in health authorities and non-compliance with public health responses. So the WHO is facilitating work across the full spectrum of what needs to be done in this space, and not just for COVID-19, but also for infodemics of the future. This includes supporting the work of researchers like me, developing new methods and tools for measuring and tracking risk factors associated with infodemics, and informing and improving interventions. Next slide, please. Infodemics are seen as dangerous, and dangerous enough for most public health authorities to allocate resources to their management. The WHO is supporting all of these efforts, from establishing a research agenda and mapping out research and gaps, supporting research that can actually measure the burden of infodemics, supporting training and the development of a toolbox that can be used for evidence-based infodemiology management, and for promoting the development of ethical frameworks for undertaking surveillance of information exposures. Later, I'll talk more about why ethical frameworks are so important if we want to be able to truly measure the infodemic burden in ways that can be made actionable. Next slide, please. But first, let's go quickly through the timeline of what has happened in the last 2 years. We start in early 2020 with the famous quotation, "We're not just fighting an epidemic, we're fighting an infodemic." We move through the first weekly infodemic digital intelligence report, through to the first WHO Global Infodemic Conference, which I attended, and you can read about in a published paper that came from that conference. The work truly started to ramp up in the second half of 2020 to include the second and third conferences and the establishment of a training program for infodemic management. Next slide, please. In 2021, we saw a range of special issues published in key journals related to infodemiology. In October, we had the 5th Infodemic Management Conference, which I'll talk about in detail later, and we reached the 90th Weekly Infodemic Digital Intelligence Report. In summary, this is just a lot of work, and it's still a challenge to connect everything that's happening up together because it necessarily involves some extremely diverse sets of disciplinary expertise. Next slide, please. So where are we at now in February of 2022? Well, you know, the WHO is focused on the following 5 research streams. I'm going to come back to these at the end of the slides, but just to note now that these include detecting and measuring infodemics and their impact, evaluating and supporting the deployment of interventions to protect against and to mitigate impacts, and developing and promoting tools that can be used to manage infodemics broadly. Next slide, please. So while the evidence base for infodemiology is growing, it's still very much in its infancy, despite the volume of papers that are being published in the area. We have several major problems with the research in this space, and I've been working in this area for quite a long time. So let me give you the rapid 4-point explainer to what's going wrong. First, most data-driven research is focused on individual social media platforms, which means it's not generalizable. Second, most research in the area makes a flawed assumption that the volume of misinformation on social media has anything to do with the concentration of exposures to that misinformation. Third, even when researchers measure exposure, they don't measure the proportion of what makes up a person's overall information diet. even when we've shown definitively that most people see very little of it relative to the rest of what they see. Fourth, and most importantly, the vast majority of research is completely disconnected from any measure of health attitudes, knowledge, behaviors, or outcomes in the real world, and simply concludes that the presence of misinformation must have an impact without actually measuring it. So for more on these problems, you might want to check out the papers that I published in Big Data and Society in 2021 on actionable surveillance, in MPJ Digital Medicine back in 2018 on connecting evidence to social media interventions, and a 2020 study in the American Journal of Public Health, where we showed that vaccine misinformation exposure is much rarer than you might think. Next slide, please. So we, as leaders in this space, have to be very careful about how we work through the next steps of setting the research agenda through targeted calls and funding. These are a couple of examples. One's a call for papers in a medical informatics journal, and another is a funding opportunity that seeks to support research investigating causal mechanisms. In both cases, and in the much broader set of new opportunities that are in the area, my personal hope is that we move beyond testing interventions in individuals in artificial scenarios that are divorced from the context of the real world, and that we move beyond thinking about social media as the only place through which infodemics spread, simply because it's easier to access the data we need without having to worry about pesky things like consent and recruitment. Next slide, please. I'm actually very proud to say that at the 5th WHO Infodemic Management Conference that I attended in November, we're already very carefully grappling with these issues, and we have made some substantial progress in this area. You might not be able to see the writing on this diagram, so I'll explain it to you in broad strokes. This formed the basis of the discussions at the conference, and the green section on the left represents the information ecosystem. The blue section includes concepts related to individuals. These are exposures, cognitive processes, and exhibited behaviors. This then connects through to the red, which includes concepts related to the health system and broader economic and social impacts. This, for us, was an especially useful way to think through how infodemics work, because it forces us to think beyond our typical spaces where we exist just in green or just in blue or just in red. The conferences work out exactly as you might imagine. While it can take a while for all of us to start speaking the same language across disciplines and between people who are working on the ground and then the theory-focused data scientists like me, once we do, it is an incredibly enlightening experience, and we're able to do much more than the sum of our parts. Next slide, please. So it was at this conference that I proposed what I think is a good way to solve many of the problems in the research space. What I think we need to do is we really need to be able to individually connect the information diets of people with the individual measures of their behavior. But there are big challenges that are introduced if we want to do this properly. The first few of these are related to recruiting participants. Not only do we have to worry about consent and data privacy, but recruiting people in their own languages and sampling populations appropriately is very hard. If we want to be smart about how we do this and divvy up the work across lots of research groups around the world, we can't do that the way we're doing it right now, because every group around the world uses different tools and protocols. They measure things that both the exposures and the outcomes in very different ways, and this makes synthesis infeasible. So to solve all of these problems at once, we are building standardized tools that replace things like old-fashioned media use diaries with their modern equivalent. We're augmenting them with passive data collection through online tracking of browsers. We're implementing machine learning methods to detect risk signatures in information diets, and then making the study tools super easy for researchers around the world to deploy as new studies, as well as making it simple as checking a box to be able to contribute their de-identified data to a global surveillance initiative. After working in this area for a lot of years now, is my roadmap for how we're actually going to be able to measure the burden of infodemics and robustly and quickly identify localized risk factors that can then be reported in ways that become actionable. Next slide, please. That idea just makes up one of the 6 things that the team from the WHO are focused on as part of their work in the area. Other than establishing working groups following the conference, you can expect to see more of the following things in 2022 and beyond. This includes continued mapping of the available evidence and identifying key research gaps that need to be filled. It includes developing tools for automated social listening. And as I've just described, it includes the tools and protocols that are needed to measure information diets that are actually linked to health outcomes. It includes the development of evidence-based scalable ways to inoculate populations against infodemics and to guide and support people who are working in the field. Next slide, please. So before I finish, let me please acknowledge the WHO Information Network for Epidemics, EpiWin, and all of the organizations you see here below. And finally, thank you all for your time and attention, and please feel free to reach out to me to talk more about what we're up to in this space. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And once again, really appreciate you staying up so late to give, I can't believe it's 2 in the morning. You were so animated. So now we have a break until 16.